In the summer of 1945, the Third Reich lay in smoldering ruins. The surviving architects of Hitler's war machine, the brilliant, ruthless generals who had conquered Europe, were now sitting in Allied prisoner of war camps. In a top-secret facility in Luxembourg known as Camp Ashcan, American intelligence officers from the Historical Division sat down with the captured German High Command. The Americans wanted to know how the Germans viewed the Allied leadership. They expected the captive Prussians to praise the strategic genius of Dwight D. Eisenhower or the methodical planning of Britain's Bernard Montgomery. Instead, the interrogators were met with a dismissive, aristocratic arrogance. The German generals viewed most Allied commanders as overly cautious, slow, and overly reliant on artillery and air support rather than tactical brilliance. But there was one name that completely changed the atmosphere in the interrogation rooms. When the name General George S. Patton Jr. was spoken, the German officers sat up straight. The arrogance vanished, replaced by a dark professional reverence. This is the exhaustive forensic breakdown of what the German High Command truly thought of old blood and guts. Their face-to-face meetings after the surrender and the terrifying realization that America had produced a general who was more German in his warfare than the Germans themselves. To understand the weight of the German compliment, you must understand who was giving it. Gerd von Rundstedt was the aristocratic, munnel-wearing commander-in-chief of the German army in the West. O.B. West. He was a man who looked down on Hitler as a bohemian corporal and viewed the Americans as undisciplined amateurs. When American interrogators asked von Rundstedt who he considered the best general the Allies had, the old field marshal didn't hesitate. He leaned forward and stated, "Patton, he is your best." When pressed on why, von Rundstedt explained that Patton was the only Allied commander who truly understood the core philosophy of the Blitzkrieg. The Germans called it Bewegung, the war of movement. Rundstedt noted that Montgomery would stop to consolidate his lines, allowing the Germans to rebuild their defenses. Eisenhower would wait for supplies, but Patton would drive his tanks until they ran out of gas, and then tell his men to get out and walk. Erwin told his captors, "He was the only one who fought with the speed and the violence of action that we used in 1940. He never gave us time to breathe." Colonel General Alfred Jodl, the chief of the operations staff of the OKW, German High Command, was the man who actually signed the unconditional surrender at Rams. He was a master of logistics and grand strategy. During his interrogations before the Nuremberg trials, Jodl made a chilling comparison. He called Patton the American Darien. Heinz Guderian was the German genius who literally wrote the book on tank warfare. Act Panzer to the German High Command, comparing an American to Guderian was the highest form of military worship. Jodl admitted that the German general staff had a specific psychological profile on Patton. They noted that Patton didn't care about his flanks. Standard military doctrine dictates that an advancing army must protect its sides. Jodl noted with begrudging admiration, Patton violated every rule of traditional warfare. He would thrust deep into our rear areas, leaving his flanks completely exposed. Any other general would have been surrounded and destroyed, but his audacity paralyzed our local commanders. They were so shocked by his presence behind their lines that they retreated instead of attacking his weak points. The greatest proof of what the German High Command thought of Patton wasn't what they said after the war. It was what they did during it. Before the D-Day invasions of June 1944, the Allies launched Operation Fortitude, a massive deception campaign involving fake inflatable tanks and bogus radio traffic. The goal was to convince Hitler that the real invasion would happen at the Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. The entire deception hinged on one man, George S. Patton. The Allies placed Patton in command of the fictional 1st U.S. Army Group, Fusegi, in southeastern England. Why? Because Allied intelligence knew that the German High Command believed Patton was the only Allied general capable of leading the main assault. When the Allies landed at Normandy, Hitler and his generals refused to send their reserve panzer divisions to crush the beachhead. They looked at the maps, saw that Patton was still in England, and concluded, if Patton is not at Normandy, then Normandy is a diversion. The German respect for Patton's lethality was so absolute that it blinded them to the reality of the war. They held their best tanks back, awaiting for a Patton invasion that never came, single-handedly saving the D-Day landings from disaster. The most surreal chapter of this story happened after the guns fell silent in May 1945. Patton was appointed the military governor of Bavaria. It was here that he actually sat in rooms with captive German officers. When Patton met with captured Wehrmacht commanders, the encounters were shockingly cordial. Patton, a student of history who believed in reincarnation and the cult of the warrior, viewed the German generals not as evil war criminals, but as fellow professionals who had simply fought for the losing side. Witnesses reported that Patton would sit with captive panzer commanders, poring over maps, trading tactical notes, and debating tank maneuvers like rival chess grandmasters discussing a match. A captive German panzer commander later wrote, "General Patton treated us with a strict, cold honor. He did not ask us about politics. He asked us about anti-tank velocities and engine maintenance. In that room, we were not prisoners and captives. We were simply soldiers." This mutual respect, however, was Patton's ultimate undoing. Grounding this in historical reality, Patton's view of the Germans was deeply, dangerously flawed. He viewed the Nazi Party as merely a political faction, famously comparing them to the Democrats and Republicans in a disastrous press conference. Because he respected the German officers' efficiency and administrative skills, he kept former Nazis in positions of power in Bavaria to keep the infrastructure running. The German officers loved this. It validated their sense of superiority. But to the Allied command and to the millions who had suffered in the Holocaust, it was a horrific betrayal. Dwight D. Eisenhower was forced to relieve Patton of his command of the Third Army. Patton's inability to separate the warrior from the war criminal ended his career. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, was interviewed extensively about the German war economy and strategy. Speer provided a completely different angle on the Patton terror. Speer noted that the German High Command could mathematically calculate exactly what Montgomery or General Bradley would do. If the British had X amount of artillery shells, they would advance Y number of miles. It was a math equation. But Patton, Speer noted, was defied our mathematics. Speer explained that the German logistics network was constantly thrown into chaos by Patton's unpredictable speed. Speer's factories would send a trainload of Tiger tank parts to a railhead in France, only to find that Patton's forward cavalry units had captured the railhead 48 hours ahead of schedule. Patton didn't just defeat the German army. He dismantled the German supply chain by simply driving through it. General Johannes Blaskowitz, who commanded Army Group G and faced Patton during the bitter fighting in the Lorraine campaign, offered a sobering, almost bitter assessment of his American rival. Blasevich respected Patton's aggression, but he also pointed out the terrifying reality of the American industrial machine. He told interrogators, "General Patton is a magnificent commander of armor, but it must be said he fought a war of abundance while we fought a war of poverty." Blasevich described the sheer psychological terror of facing the Third Army. If a German unit managed to brilliantly ambush and destroy a column of Patton's Sherman tanks, Patton wouldn't retreat. He would simply call the sky. Within an hour, swarms of P-47 Thunderbolts would obliterate the German positions, and a brand new column of replacement Shermans would drive over the burning wreckage of the first. Blasewicz realized that Patton's true genius wasn't just his tactics. It was his ruthless willingness to spend American industrial wealth to crush German flesh and bone. Why do we still study the relationship between Patton and the defeated German High Command? The universal language of tactics. Patton proved that speed, aggression, and violence of action transcend nationality. He beat the masters of the blitzkrieg at their own game. The danger of the pure soldier. While Patton's tactical genius won the war, his controversial post-war behavior with the German generals showed the limits of treating war purely as a game of gentlemen. Clear's throat. His respect blinded him to the moral atrocities of the regime he defeated. The ultimate deception. The German High Command's obsessive fear and respect for Patton changed the course of world history by ensuring the success of D-Day.